There is a particular kind of confidence a man puts on when he has persuaded himself that whoever is about to walk through his door has come entirely for his benefit. It is a quiet, settled thing, not loud, not theatrical, but visible in the way he does not rise when she enters, in the deliberate unhurry of his attention, in the small, composed expression that says, "I have decided to be pushed with you, and you ought to feel grateful for it." Lord Evander Stonebridge, Viscount of Stonebridge, wore that expression in its most fully realized form on the morning of the 14th of November, 1843, as he sat behind the great oak desk in his study at Stonebridge Hall and waited for the man from Berkeley's to arrive. He had not slept well in some months, which was a thing he would have died before admitting. The estate was in the kind of trouble that keeps a man honest with the dark at 3 in the morning, even when it keeps him perfectly dishonest with everyone else at every other hour. 3 years since he had inherited the title and the land, and the debts his father had hidden with particular, almost artistic thoroughness. 3 years of trying to manage an estate he had never been trained to manage, in a trade he had been kept deliberately distant from. Because his father, and here I must pause to give you the full picture of Lord Stonebridge's father, for without it you will not understand the son. His father had believed, with the settled conviction of a man who has never once questioned himself, that Evander was not built for it. Not clever enough, his father had said. Too gentle, too inclined toward books and questions and the kind of thinking that produces writers and clergymen, and not, emphatically not, men who run 3,000 acres and a string of tenant farms and a collapsing mill at the north end of the property. His elder brother had been the one built for it, sharp, decisive, easy with command. And his elder brother had died of fever at 22, and the whole great inheritance had landed squarely on Evander's unsuitable shoulders, and the old Viscount had spent his remaining years communicating through gesture and silence precisely how little confidence he had that the unsuitable son would manage. Do you begin to see it? Do you begin to understand the sort of man who sat behind that desk on that November morning, proud and sleepless, and arranging his face into the expression of a man who is perfectly in control of the situation? The door opened and the steward said, "Miss Farr, my lord." And a woman walked in. Not a man. Not the clerk or junior associate Lord Stonebridge had been expecting from Butler's last letter. A woman, perhaps 9 and in a plain dark travelling coat, carrying a leather case under one arm and a roll of documents under the other, looking at him with the particular direct steadiness of someone who has already sized up the room and found it entirely unsurprising. Lord Stonebridge did not stand. He glanced up, registered her, arrived at a conclusion in the space of a breath. A secretary, obviously, sent ahead of the real party, and returned his gaze to his papers for a full 30 seconds before addressing her, so that she might understand from the very first that her time was entirely subordinate to his. "You may sit," he said, without looking up fully. "Tell your employer I will see him directly. I assume he is following behind you." "I am the one you will be seeing, my lord," said Miss Farr, in a voice of such extraordinary pleasantness that it took him a full moment to register what she had actually said. He looked at her. She had sat down, in the chair he had not offered her, and was withdrawing from her leather case a single document, which she placed on the edge of his desk with the precision of a person who wastes nothing, least of all gestures. "Miss Lucinda Farr," she said, "Berkeley's senior estate assessor for the northern counties. I have been assessing failing properties in Yorkshire and Lancashire for 11 years, and I am, I believe, the 4th such professional you have received in the past 18 months, which is in itself a rather significant data point for my report." She paused, and then said, with the same composed pleasantness, "I am not here, my lord, to help you construct a case to present. I am here to determine whether one can honestly be made, whether this estate is worth Berkeley's continued patience, or whether I recommend the loan be called in by the 1st of January. That decision rests entirely with my assessment, and my assessment has already begun." She folded her hands and met his gaze with absolute steadiness. "Shall we proceed, or would you prefer a few moments to collect yourself? I want you to hold that image for a moment, dear friends." The Viscount of Stonebridge behind his great desk, all the paperwork of a failing estate spread before him, and a woman in a plain traveling coat regarding him with the calm of someone who has done this many times before, and found the outcome entirely within her capacity to manage. Whatever he had expected that morning, it was not this, whatever he had braced himself for. It was not to discover that the person holding his financial future in her hands was looking at him not with deference, not with apology, but with the measuring, unhurried regard of a professional who has already begun to form her conclusions. "I think," he said, and his voice had the tight, controlled quality of a man working very hard not to lose his composure, "that there has been some kind of error. Barclays would not send a woman," she said it without inflection, "an associate of your stated seniority, without first notifying me that." "They did notify you, my lord. The letter of the 3rd of October named me specifically Miss L. Farr, senior assessor." She tilted her head very slightly. "I imagine the title misled you, it often does." Lord Stonebridge stared at her. "And here is where I must tell you something, dear friends, because it is the whole heart of the matter." He was, at this moment, entirely at her mercy. She held the assessment, she held the recommendation, she could write one paragraph to Barclays, and his creditors would begin foreclosure proceedings before Christmas. His pride was screaming at him to dismiss her, to send for someone senior, to prove that no woman with a leather case could walk into Stonebridge Hall and tell him the terms of his own ruin. And his terror, the sleepless, 3 a.m. terror of a man drowning in an inheritance he was never trained to manage, was screaming something else entirely. "Get out," he said quietly. "I will write to Barclays this afternoon." Miss Farr rose. She gathered her document from the edge of his desk, tucked it back into the leather case, and turned toward the door with the unhurried movement of someone who expected exactly this, and had already decided what to do about it. She walked to the door, she put her hand on the handle, and then she stopped. "And I am going to stop right there with you, dear friends." Right there with her hand on the handle and the whole future of Stonebridge Hall balanced on a single moment. Because before I tell you what she said, before I tell you what those quiet words unlocked in a man who had carried his father's verdict on himself for 34 years, you and I have our small arrangement to honor. If you have not yet subscribed to Moonlight at Bellwood, I ask you now. It costs nothing, it takes only a moment, and it means you will not miss a single one of these stories, and there is always a next one, and they are always worth the sitting still, for if you will not, well, you will owe me one. I keep very careful accounts, I never forget a debt, and I always know very precisely who has yet to settle theirs. Now the handle, and what she said. She did not turn around. She said it to the door, in that same composed voice, though there was something beneath it now. Something quiet and edged, like a blade wrapped carefully in cloth. "You have had 4 assessors in 3 years, my lord. 3 men, and now myself. I have been in this room for 20 minutes, and I have observed a man too proud to be helped, and too frightened to admit he needs it. But I have also seen along your south wall a stack of ledgers that no one intending to abandon an estate would have bothered to annotate so carefully." She paused. "Someone has been trying very hard to save this place. I do not think the estate is what is failing here, and I think you know that too, which is why you are so angry." She let that sit for one breath. "Good morning, my lord." She turned the handle. Wait. It came out before Lord Stonebridge had decided to say it. It was not the voice he used with creditors, or with tenants, or with anyone who had seen him in the past 3 years. It was the voice beneath all of those, with no performance in it at all, only the plain, unguarded sound of a man who has just watched his last real option move toward the door. Miss Farr did not turn round immediately. She let the words stand in the air between them. She let him hear what it had cost him. Then she came back. She sat down in the chair, opened her leather case, withdrew a fresh sheet of paper and a pencil. She waited. Lord Evander Stonebridge, behind his great desk with his father's assessment reverberating somewhere in the back of his skull. Not clever enough, too gentle, not built for this. Looked at the woman who had named, without knowing its name, the precise wound at the center of everything. And he did something he had not done since long before his father died. He told the truth. Not the managed, careful truth he presented to his solicitor and his bank. The actual truth. The annotated ledgers were his. He had kept them every evening for 2 years, trying to understand what he kept doing wrong, what any man with proper training would have done differently. The 3 previous assessors had not been driven off by incompetence. They had been driven off by his own desperate interference, because accepting their guidance had felt, in the most irrational and stubborn part of him, like confirming everything his father had believed, that the wrong son had survived, that the estate would fail because he was the one left to run it. He told her all of it. The way a thing comes out, when the pressure holding it in is suddenly, finally gone. The cold father and the beloved elder brother and the 34 years of being told he was the one that wouldn't do. And the 3 sleepless years since the title came to him, and the ledgers. The private, shameful attempt to educate himself in the dark, where no one would see that he needed educating. When he finished, he was very still. "There it is then," he said. "That is your assessment." "No," said Miss Farr, "that is the beginning of it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, in a different voice than any she had used, not professional, not composed, but something older and more carefully held, she said, "The 4th assessor always gets the truth. The first 3 get the armor. You should know this is not unusual. It is, in fact, rather the rule." He looked at her. "My father was an assessor," she said. "The finest one I ever knew. He taught me that a failing estate almost never fails by accident. There is almost always a person at the center of it, and the question that matters is not what has gone wrong. It is why the person at the center could not ask for help. Once you understand that, you know whether the estate can be saved." She held his gaze. "Yours can. I knew it before you said a word. The ledgers told me. A man who does not care does not annotate his ledgers in 3 different inks at 11 o'clock at night." There was a silence that felt, for the first time in 3 years, like the kind that comes before something rather than after it. "What happens next?" Lord Stonebridge asked slowly. "Next," said Miss Farr, "I do my job. I go through every acre and every account and every outstanding obligation on this estate, and then I write an honest report to Barclays recommending either patience or foreclosure. I have never written a dishonest report in 11 years, and I will not begin for you." She picked up her pencil. "But so I've written a foreclosure recommendation for an estate I believed could be saved, and I do not intend to begin for you either so." She looked at him steadily. "Shall we start with the mill?" They started with the mill. "And I am going to move us forward, dear friends, because what followed was 2 years of careful, difficult, extraordinary work, and I cannot do it justice in the time we have. I will tell you only this. Miss Lucinda Farr was every bit as good as 11 years of reputation had made her, and Stonebridge Hall bloomed under her assessment, like a property that had been waiting, under the wrong management, under the wrong understanding, to finally show what it had always been capable of. She found where the money was bleeding and stopped it. She renegotiated the mill lease on terms that should have been apparent to anyone with 6 months' experience, and were apparently apparent to no one too proud to ask for advice. She met with the tenant farmers herself, a thing that had not been done in 6 years, and discovered that 3 of the most productive plots had lain fallow because of a drainage dispute that a single afternoon's honest conversation resolved entirely. She produced, within 4 months, a report recommending not only continued patience from Barclays, but projecting full solvency within 2 years. And Lord Stonebridge, in the hardest discipline of his life, did not interfere. He had made a promise the morning she came back from the door, and he kept it. Every time the old instinct rose, to question, to overrule, to prove he was managing the thing himself. He mastered it. He let her be good at her work, and he discovered, week by week, the most extraordinary truth of his life, that the world did not end when he admitted he could not do something alone. That learning from a person more skilled than himself did not diminish him. It made room for him in his own proper sphere to become something he had never been allowed to imagine being. And somewhere in the space between the drainage dispute and the mill renegotiation and the long autumn rides around the property, Lord Evander Stonebridge fell in love with Miss Lucinda Farr. He fell in love with her mind first, with the sharpness of it, the complete absence of pretense, the way she would sit across the desk at 9 in the evening and hold an argument until they had reached the truth of it, and then stop immediately, because the truth was the point, and never the winning. He fell in love with the way she spoke to his tenants, with a plain directness they trusted at once. He fell in love with the small private warmth behind the professional composure, visible only in unguarded moments. The way she laughed when the mill foreman told a terrible joke, the way she went very still when a solution had just arrived to her, as though she were listening to something the rest of the room could not quite hear. And he fell, as men do when they know they are falling without a net, all the harder because he knew every single day that she did not need him in the least. She had Barclays, she had 11 years of standing, she had 3 other properties wanting her at any given moment. If she stayed, it was because the work was worth staying for. That freedom she moved through, complete, earned, self-made freedom, was the most intimidating and the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed up close. He did not tell her for a long time. He was, as you will have gathered, a man with considerable experience of keeping the most important things silent. But the estate was nearly finished, and he knew, watching her begin quietly to close the ledgers and prepare for her next commission, that if he did not say it, he would spend the remainder of his life in the particular company of that silence, which is the worst company there is. So on the evening of the 16th of October, 1845, in the estate office, where they had spent 2 years side by side, he told her. He said it plainly, because he had learned from her that plainness is a form of respect, that he loved her, that he had loved her since the morning she turned back for sing the door at the sound of a single word and chose freely to come back, that she had not merely saved the estate, she had returned to him a version of himself he had not known he was permitted to be. And he asked her to marry him. He paused, watching her face. "I can see," he said quietly, "that I have said something that has frightened you, and I don't know what it is. So will you tell me?" Miss Lucinda Farr, who had not wept in a very long time, who had built herself into a legend of precision and professional authority, felt something shift underneath her, and she told him the truth. She told him about her mother, about watching her mother's inheritance, her mother's talent, her mother's sense of her health disappear the morning after the wedding, folded into the word wife, absorbed entirely by law into her husband's name. Her mother had been a painter, a gifted one. She never painted again after she married, not because her father was cruel, he was not cruel at all, which in some ways made it worse. The law did not ask whether the husband was cruel. The law simply transferred everything and placed it in his hands, and no amount of kindness changed the nature of the transfer. And she told him about her first estate assessment at 19, before her father's name had yet protected her when she was new to the trade and still believed that courtesy signaled safety. The lord of that property had been grateful. He had been warm. He had, when her assessment proved accurate and his estate recovered, published her report under his own name and written to Barclays to credit his own good management for the turnaround. When she protested, he described her as a fraud. It had taken her 4 years to rebuild her professional name from that ruin, 4 years of doing perfect work in quiet obscurity, waiting for the truth to accumulate enough evidence to finally speak for itself. From those two things, her mother's disappeared self and her own near destruction, she had made two rules that had governed her life ever since. She would never allow any man to take credit for her work. And she would never marry, because marriage, in the eyes of the law, was the respectable word for the permanent transfer of everything she had built. "It is not you," she said, and she meant it entirely. "You are one of the finest men I have ever known, and believe me when I tell you I know what a fine man looks like by now. I have had to examine a great many of them quite carefully to survive this trade. It is not you, it is the law. It is what the law does to a woman the morning after she marries. Regardless of who she is marrying, I would become your wife, Evander, and your wife is not permitted to be Lucinda Farr. And Lucinda Farr is the only thing I have that cannot be taken from me a second time." She stood. "I have to go," she said, "not because I don't." She stopped. Then, more quietly, "I have to go before this costs me something I cannot afford to lose." And Lord Evander Stonebridge, who had learned at Lucinda Farr's side that the strongest thing a person can do is refuse to let their fear make their decisions for them, sat with that for a long moment. He did not argue. He did not reach for his own hurt and use it as a weapon. He thought carefully, the way she had taught him to think. Past the obvious answer. Past the first response, toward the one that was actually true. "Then we won't do it the law's way," he said. She looked at him. "There are legal instruments," he said, leaning forward, "designed exactly for this purpose. Marriage settlements, trusts, agreements drawn before the ceremony that protect a woman's property in her own name, beyond her husband's legal reach. Wealthy families in this country use them constantly to protect their daughters' inheritances. We will use them to protect yours, your assessments, your professional name, your income, everything that is Lucinda Farr, protected by signed agreement and enforceable in law, beyond any authority of mine to touch." He paused. "And more than that?" His voice went quieter. "I am not asking you to stop being who you are. I would not know what to do with a wife who was not Lucinda Farr. I fell in love with the person who turned back from my door when I said wait, not because she had to, but because she chose to. That is the person I am asking." He held out his hand across the desk. "Not a transfer, a partnership, your work yours, your name yours, your independence yours, and alongside all of it if you can bear it. One person who sees you clearly, who is not afraid of how good you are, and who has no intention of ever being anything other than grateful that you exist. I will not make you wait for the answer, dear friends. You have sat with me long enough tonight, and you have earned it, and I am not the kind of storyteller who withholds what you came here for." She said yes. Not immediately. There were several weeks, and a solicitor with an excellent head for settlements, and a considerable amount of productive argument about precise wording. But she said yes, and she meant it the way she meant everything, completely, after having examined it from every angle and found it sound. The settlements were drawn up ironclad, exactly as he had promised. Her professional name on every contract she signed, her income entirely her own. Her assessments registered as her intellectual property, her complete freedom to take on whatever commissions she chose, to go wherever the work called her, to be in every professional respect precisely who she had made herself over 11 years of hard, brilliant, solitary work. She married Lord Evander Stonebridge on a Tuesday in March 1846 in the chapel at Stonebridge Hall, in the presence of the mill foreman and 3 tenant farmers and the regional director from Barclays, who wept quietly into a handkerchief and later denied it. She wore a sensible dress. She kept her professional name on every document that mattered. She went on her next assessment the following month and wrote the report in her own hand and signed it as she had always signed it. She became the Viscountess of Stonebridge and remained the finest estate assessor in the north of England, and Stonebridge Hall flourished under the honest, unglamorous, extraordinarily capable stewardship of 2 people who had each given the other permission to be entirely themselves, and who found, in that permission, the only kind of love that is worth the name. The old Viscount Evander's cold and disappointed father was in his grave and could not see it. That is the only pity in the whole of the tale. His son had proved him wrong in the only way that mattered, not by doing it alone, not by performing competence until the performance became real, but by knowing, at the one decisive moment, when to say wait, and when to hold the door open, and when to put out his hand and offer someone who had never needed rescuing the one thing she had never allowed herself to have. If you ask me what this story is truly about, dear friends, I will tell you it is about who really holds the power in a room, and how seldom it is the person sitting behind the largest desk. Lord Stonebridge sat behind his oak desk on that November morning, certain he was the one with something to give. The woman in the plain travelling coat was the one with everything to decide. But the deeper truth, the one I find myself returning to on evenings like this one, the one I hope you carry home with you tonight, is not about power at all. It is about the moment a proud, frightened person decides that being truly known is worth the risk of being fully seen. He said wait, and she turned around. She said no, and he found a better question to ask. Neither of them surrendered themselves. That is the whole secret. That is every bit of it. The right love does not ask you to become smaller. It asks you only to lay down the weight of proving, constantly and alone, that you were never small to begin with. Subscribe to Moonlight at Bellwood, dear friends, and come back to me next time beneath the soft light of the evening star, where every love is hard-won and every ending is deserved. Good night, and mind how you dismiss the quiet soul who has just walked into your room carrying a leather case and a measured, unhurried regard. She may already be deciding whether you are worth the saving.